Life is full of surprises. Sometimes your mind can play tricks on you, and sometimes you try to trick yourself into not seeing something you've seen. Deep down in your heart, you absolutely know that it was as real as the air you breathe. You question yourself, sometimes for days, trying to make sense of what happened. You may be too embarrassed to share what you have gone through, the emotional toll of the experience, the dread that you live with day in, day out. On the other hand, you're afraid to share the encounter that has had a positive impact, the experience that sent your heart soaring and confirmed long-held beliefs just because someone may think you've lost it. Or maybe, just maybe, you're looking for answers like the rest of us. You've come to the right place. You've come to Night Tales TV.
Welcome to the first episode of Night Tales TV. My name is Philip, and my purpose for creating this show is to create a community of like-minded individuals by telling your stories. I want everyone to realize that they are not alone in their experiences and that they have an outlet. I know there are people out there who are too afraid or too embarrassed to share their stories with friends or family because they may be viewed as crazy. It doesn't matter what your story is either. I want to hear and tell your stories from all aspects of the paranormal. It can be about ghosts, UFOs, cryptids, black-eyed children, or the miraculous. It can be dark and scary or uplifting. If you'd like me to tell your story, please email me at nighttalestv@gmail.com. Please be as descriptive as possible, i.e. sight, sound, feel, all that stuff. Also, if you'd like to remain anonymous, that's fine as well, and I will never sell your information. Thank you. Again, welcome, and with no further ado, here is my own personal story. It all began, at least from memory anyway, when I was around 4. My family and I were living in a small town with a population of about 100 people in southeastern Kansas. There were 3 bedrooms in our house, one for my parents, one for my sister, and one for my 2 older brothers and I. I was the youngest of 4. The house was an old house, as were most of the houses in our small town. Everybody knew everyone, and it was the kind of place where if you were doing something wrong, your parents knew about it before you got home. My first memory of the strange was I distinctly remember laying on the living room floor, getting ready to go to sleep. Sometimes we would sleep in there because there was no air conditioning. This was the early 1980s. Air conditioners weren't that widespread and they were extremely expensive. As we were all laying down to go to sleep, one of my siblings says, "Look at that," and pointed at the wall. Moving across the wall was what I believe a shadow person or persons. I remember seeing the tall, slender figure of a woman and a squat-looking figure of a fat man. Think of the opening to any of Alfred Hitchcock's movies. That's what it was. More shadows were playing like a movie walking across the wall, but those 2 I for sure remember. It wasn't really scary though, at least that I remember. Living in the same house, my sister and I were outside playing about dark. My sister grabbed me and pointed at our swing set. Only one swing was swinging and there was no wind blowing. Needless to say, we ran inside. The scariest event that I remember in that house was one night while in bed. As I said, we boys shared a bedroom. When you walked through the doorway, my bed was on the left, my eldest brother's bed was on the right, facing the opposite direction, and my middle brother's bed next to a large window directly across from mine. The lights were out, and the only light that entered the room was a light from a street light down the block. I distinctly remember seeing the silhouette of what looked like a head at the very top of the window. It appeared to be peering into our room. It would sit there for a few seconds, then it would move back up to where it couldn't be seen, then lower its head down and look through the window again. I watched this go on for what seemed like forever, at least to a 4-year-old. Then, all at once, a huge black mass, mist, fog, I don't know, came through the window and landed on my eldest brother who was asleep. It didn't just nonchalantly float across the room, it came through the window with force. They seemed to struggle for a minute, and the form went through the bedroom door into the living room. I sat up slowly and looked through the doorway, and it was gone. I don't remember anything else from that house. We moved from there when I was 5. Where we did move was an old farmhouse just outside of town. It was your ideal farmhouse, fenced-in property, white house, and a big red barn to the back of the yard. A friend of mine was sleeping over, and we were outside way after dark looking up at the stars as it was a crystal clear night. You could see millions. You could see what later I would learn were satellites moving rapidly across the night sky. Then we spotted a light moving extremely fast from north to south. It looked like a bright star. However, it didn't move like your typical satellite or airplane. It would move rapidly in a certain direction and then perform a 90-degree turn. The only other thing I remember from that house was that I was taking a bath. Right next to the tub was a small open window, Again, this was at night, and there was no light bleeding in from outside. I was washing, and when I looked out the window, I could see the face of something just on the other side of the screen. It reminded me of a fox, but much larger, as the window was 4 or 5 feet off the ground. It made no noise, but it was right there looking at me with a malicious grin on its face, just a matter of inches from me. I began to scream and cry out in fear. My mother came running to check on me, and I told her what I saw. She looked, and it was gone. After that, I was afraid of going to the bathroom after dark. Not long after that, we moved to the house where I would live until I went in the military. It was my great-grandfather's house, just 2 houses down from the old house we used to live in. My parents purchased the home for my great-uncle, and they did a massive amount of remodeling. Everything started when we would hear footsteps at night. It sounded as if my dad was walking down the hall from my parents' bedroom. We would go look, and my dad would be snoring. Then we would be watching TV late, either laying on the couch or sitting on the recliner. You could look and see the rocking chair rocking on its own. The entryway door would open and close at times even after ensuring it was shut, and pictures would come out and fall off the wall as it tossed. All these happenings were so frequent that they became commonplace. Nobody would pay any attention to them. I remember one year near Christmas, I was around 10 or so. My grandparents had come up from Arkansas to spend the holiday with us. They were sleeping in my room, so me being the youngest, I had to pull couch duty. The only lights in the house were the lights from the Christmas tree. As I woke up, I remember seeing what looked to be my great-grandmother. Whatever it was, it looked to be wearing an older-style, full-length flower print dress. She had short curly hair that you would expect to see on an older woman, and horn-rimmed glasses. What was odd was that she had a blue glowing hue emanating from her. I find it funny that I wasn't scared. Sure, there was a little bit of shock factor going on, but I watched her watch me for a minute, then I rolled over and went back to sleep. In 1996, I was in the military and was going through boot camp. I found out that my grandmother had cancer, and when I graduated, I went home, and while there I spent as much time with her as I could, which wasn't much because I was only home for a couple of weeks. A year later, I was in my MOS school in Florida. I was in bed one night, and I awoke with a start. I looked down at the front foot of my bed, and my grandmother was standing there. I could hear her say, "I'm okay now, I don't hurt anymore." Early the next morning, there was a knock on my door, and it was the duty non-commissioned officer. He was there to notify me of my grandmother's passing. When I opened the door, and he told me about my grandmother, I looked at him and said, "I know, I'll be okay." And I was. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it home for her funeral, but I was at peace with it because I had seen her the night before, and in my own way, I was able to say goodbye. A couple of years later, I was at my duty station in South Carolina. I was married, and I'd had an infant son. The house we were renting was an old house that belonged to our landlady's late father. There was a peaceful feeling that emanated from the house. One night while laying in bed, my wife and I heard our son start to cry. Then we could hear what sounded like someone patting his bottom, and he quit crying. I got up to investigate, and there was no one there. A few months later, my wife's younger sister was visiting for a couple weeks. I was on the night shift, so I wasn't home. My sister-in-law was sleeping with my wife when she heard someone walking down the hall and investigated in the mirror that pointed down the hall. She said that she saw a man walking towards the bedroom and thought that I had gotten home from work, so she got up and went and slept in the other room. When I woke up the next day, my wife asked me when I got home, and it was long after the events of the evening. Sometime in 2002-2003, I was out of the military. We had moved to Arkansas to help my mother-in-law, and I was working as a corrections officer for the state. Needless to say, it was an extremely negative place. Now here's where it gets weird. I'm not sure if it was just a bad dream or a spiritual attack. Either way, 16 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It started out, and I was in what looked to be a palace. There were ivory white columns with the purest gold ivy wrapped around each of the columns. The floors were the most immaculate marble I have ever seen. The throne was the most radiant white. You couldn't even look at it for but a second. Then I heard a piercing scream, and the entire room seemed to decompose in front of my eyes. The columns seemed to melt into a pile of greenish liquid and sizzled like acid was eating away at them. The floors were covered in rotten decay, and when I turned to look in the direction of the scream, there was the evilest figure I've ever seen. I knew it was evil because I could feel it at the primal level. It seemed to be blacker than black, like it absorbed all light. It had fiery red eyes and razor-sharp teeth, and the stench was unbearable. In an instant, it leapt and landed on me, crushing the breath out of me. The weight and pain were excruciatingly unbearable. and I knew I was going to die. The more I screamed or tried to, the heavier it became. I couldn't breathe. My voice became quieter and quieter. In what I knew was my last gasp, I whispered one word, Jesus. When I uttered the name, the entity screamed out in pain, as if it had been pierced. I said it again, although quietly, and it screamed again. The pressure on my chest lifted somewhat as the being was shrinking. I shouted more powerfully, and it screamed and shrunk more. I noticed that every time I said the name, the room began to rebuild. This kept up until the being shrank away into a bright ray of light, and the room was restored to its full glory. I then awoke in a cold sweat with my chest hurting and breath heaving. This disturbed me so much that I went to talk with the chaplain at work. I told him what I went through. He believed it to be a spiritual attack, and everything that happened was rooted in the Bible. In 2005, I have another son, and my family and I moved back to Kansas. We rented an old farmhouse along the Kansas-Oklahoma state line. My best friend lived down the road from me, and the house was his late grandfather's. It was a 2-story house, and as you walked up the stairs, you came into a small room. Then you would walk through the doorway to the next room, and it was huge, the entire length of the house. Right away, something felt off. I didn't listen to my gut feeling. After all, we needed a place to live. We moved in, and as we were unpacking, the more I would go upstairs, the more nervous I felt. It felt as if I were always being watched up there. Coming out of the large room, I looked through the window and saw an unusual number of flies between the screen and the window. They seemed to congregate there. Alarm bells were going off, but I ignored them. Again, we needed a place to live. Some time went by, and the feeling of dread never went away. I made my boys sleep in the small room just so they didn't have to go into the large room. At night, if I was taking the dogs out or just walking around, I could feel eyes boring a hole through me. I was never comfortable there. Eventually, I started making my boys sleep downstairs because I couldn't bear the thought of them being up there. I removed the door and put it at the doorway leading to the stairs because I could feel something there every time I would walk by. I spoke to a friend of mine who was a very devout Christian about what I could feel in my home. She was weirded out as well, and she advised me to anoint my home with anointing oil. She told me to mark all the doorways and windows with a cross and recite a prayer that she had written down. The day came, I sent my boys outside to play, my wife was working, and it was just me alone in the house. I started in the kitchen, praying and marking doors and windows. As I worked my way through the house, going room to room, I kept feeling a heavy weight on my chest, and I was short of breath. The closer I came to the stairway, the heavier it got. I completed all the rooms downstairs, but I couldn't bring myself to go up the stairs. It was as if there was a barrier in place, and I was mentally and physically exhausted. Not long after that, we moved to a different house. Although I've had a few experiences since then, there is nothing noteworthy, at least to me, that's worth telling. Maybe it's because of a lifetime of experiences. Maybe it's because I'm so busy that I don't take the time to notice the noises or signs. I believe the house I currently live in, an old farmhouse that's over 120 years old, has some activity. I've seen things like a mist at the foot of my bed, and I felt a presence here, but it's not malevolent. My son has said he's experienced some things here, but nothing dramatic. I've experienced enough in my life to say that I truly believe. Again, that was my personal story, and I hope you enjoyed it. My life has been nothing short of amazing with encounters. I believe something's there. I believe something's out there. And if you want me to tell your story, please don't hesitate to email me at nighttalestv@gmail.com and let me get your story out there, especially if you think you need help. If you want to get your story out, just by all means, please email me there. I'll put that in the link below. And if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe and click the little bell. That way you get a notification. That way you know when my next show is on. Again, thanks. Have a good one.